General, thanks for being with us. Let me start specifically with the military strategy. We've had weeks of bombing, and yet IS has made gains around Kobane and Anbar province. Is it working?
Well, I think it is. The purpose of the airstrikes was to buy time, ultimately to begin the process of refurbishing and regenerating the Iraqi security forces, and to buy time ultimately to get those forces into the field, to begin to confront the ISIL forces and begin to push them back. What this has done is it's created an opportunity for us to have that time.
You had arms drops to Kurdish fighters. There is video showing that some of it may have got into IS hands. How concerned are you that you've ended up arming the very people that you're fighting?
Well, it's a very small amount. It may have been one bundle out of 28 bundles. And if any of those weapons or any of that material got into their hands, it would have been a relatively small amount. We have a very accurate method of delivering that system and delivering those weapons, and we think that the vast majority of that got into the hands of the defenders of Kobane.
Does the US have any intelligence about the possible use of chemical weapons by IS? There was a report only last month saying it was plausible, their use.
We've heard those reports, and we're looking into them.
Do you think they're plausible?
Well, we're going to look into all the reports. We're going to gather all the information that we can about this to determine whether it could be a plausible employment of chemical weapons. But we'll take reports like that very seriously.
Now, you've been shuttling across the region. There's been frustration in Washington about how much Turkey is doing. Do you share that frustration?
I think Turkey's actually done quite a bit. Turkey's an old friend of the United States, but it's also, in the case of the UK as well, an ally from NATO. Turkey has been bearing an enormous burden in terms of providing humanitarian assistance to well over 1 million, nearly 1.5 million refugees.
It has, but clearly you would like more. What more would you like to see from them?
Well, Turkey has also in the public domain, we've talked about Turkey providing a training and equipping site, providing trainers to that. And beyond that, we're in a conversation with the Turks and with the government. And we think that conversation will result in some other commitments by Turkey. But for now, we'll leave the conversation to result in that.
The broader strategy that you outlined at the top is to degrade IS, to provide the space for the Iraqi army, the Peshmerga fighters, to actually battle this on the ground. What happens if they can't do that?
Well, I won't attempt to comment on the negative hypothesis here. I think what we seek to do is to give them the capabilities of doing it. It's not something that's going to happen tomorrow. It's not something that's going to happen in the next several months. But we do expect that over time, with the right kind of train and equip and advisory and assistance capacity and building into the capabilities of the ministries, that we can provide them.
But you said that for 10 years before America left Iraq and we saw the Iraqi army turn and run. If the second part of that equation doesn't happen, and given the threat that has been outlined by your president, if the second part doesn't happen, it has to come back to American coalition boots on the ground, doesn't it?
Well, at this point, we believe that it will happen. We believe that we have the capacity over time, working with the Iraqis, to build the capability of recovering the territorial integrity of Iraq and ultimately the sovereignty.
But that doesn't sound like you've got a plan B at all.
We don't need a plan B at this point. At this point, we believe that we're going to have the capability of building up those forces over time. Look, we've just had quite a political breakthrough in Baghdad. Prime Minister Abadi has taken very important steps to form a government. It's the first full cabinet that's been formed since 2010.
But these are all hopes, aren't they, about what it might lead to?
Well, it's planning. It's not hopes, it's planning. And we ultimately expect that as we commit the kinds of resources necessary to the training and the equipping of the Iraqi security forces, that those forces will be able to accomplish the objectives of the Iraqi government and also the objectives of the coalition.
Would it be helpful to the operation if the UK joined airstrikes against Syria?
Well, I'll leave that ultimately for the UK to decide. The UK has been very helpful to this point in a whole variety of ways. And we're talking continually about other ways in which the UK could become involved. But
other ways, sure. But I was talking to the former head of the British Army on this programme only a couple of weeks ago. He said the current strategy is half a strategy. It's half the battle only going after Iraq and not Syria. He hoped that would change. Do you hope it would change?
Well, we are going after the
No, I mean the British.
Forces. Well, I leave that for the British government ultimately to decide. We'll have conversations with them about where the UK forces and UK contributions can be valuable to the strategy.
It would help, wouldn't it?
Well, having additional fires in Syria would be helpful, but we're not going to ask specifically the UK government to contribute that without ultimately having a conversation about how their role would unfold and how long they would unfold and the targets that they might attack. So we have a conversation underway with the UK government, and ultimately your government will be the one that will decide that.
So that is still ongoing, that conversation about UK airstrikes being part of this coalition?
Oh, yes.
That conversation is currently still happening?
We're having a broad conversation with the UK government about how it can contribute ultimately to this strategy overall.
You're heading to the region, to the Gulf, countries like Saudi Arabia. You still need to turn off the tap of financing to IS, don't you?
Well, we think that in many respects ISIS is almost self-sufficient at this point, given the amount of its ability to generate resources and revenue from illicit oil smuggling, from other criminality, the trafficking, illegal trafficking of antiquities, the coercive activities, the criminal activities associated with what it's undertaking. But there has been some contributions, obviously, over time, which has given them some capacity. And we're targeting that as well. One of the multiple lines of operations of this strategy is, in fact, understanding the revenue generation capabilities.
But it's another hope, isn't it?
No, it's not a hope. We're actually deeply engaged in that process. We're partnering with a number of countries to understand the supply chain of the
The point I'm making, though, is that it still hasn't happened.
No, it's not true. We are deeply engaged in this. We've been destroying modular refineries which generate oil, which ultimately is trafficked. We're working closely with partner governments with the idea of designating individuals who are part of the illegal trafficking of illicit oil. We're talking about sanctions. We're talking about indictments. So we're partnering with a number of countries to get at this. So it's not a hope. It's in fact a reality what we're doing.
Part of the US plan, obviously, is to arm the moderates in Syria. Mm-hmm. Isn't the danger, you only have to look at Libya, the same approach, there's mayhem there now. Do you actually know who these people are?
Well, we intend to vet them, and we've vetted some to this point. But it's not a singular act. The act, of course, is not just the arming and the training and equipping of the Free Syrian Army and other elements of the moderate Syrian opposition, but it's also encouraging the political echelon of the moderate Syrian opposition to become more cohesive and better organized so that the entity together, the political echelon supported by a credible field force, creates that very important voice for the political outcome that we seek in Syria.
The point is, we made in this country, why not just leave this battle, to the countries in the region?
Because this is an issue of dealing with the emergency of ISIL. And in that context, giving the Free Syrians the capacity ultimately to deal with ISIL as a threat serves the interest not just of the region, but also the countries
but not just the
that are
Syrians.
dealing
I
with
mean,
this.
all of the governments, Saudi Arabia,
That's
Kuwait,
right.
Jordan,
and their partners,
Iran. Why don't you just leave it to those countries in that region?
Because we have brought the leadership through the coalition to dealing with ISIL in a comprehensive way, some part of which is the training of the Free Syrian elements, some part of which is the encouragement of the Syrian political elements to come together in a cohesive way.
Given the influence of Iran in the region, doesn't it make sense to bring them within the umbrella?
We have encouraged Iran to play a constructive role in this area, and we're willing to talk to Iran about that.
Just in terms of your assessment of the basic threat to our norms, our way of life, the challenge, is this the greatest threat, do you think, in our lifetime?
I think it is a threat. I think ISIL is an emblem of a much deeper issue, and that's the issue of extremism in the area. And while we'll deal with ISIL in the short term, because it is a great threat ultimately to the territorial integrity and the coherence of Iraq, it's a great threat now to Syria, it's a threat to the countries of the region. We have other threats that ISIL represents and symbolizes that we need to deal with. So I think it's not perhaps the greatest threat, but it is an emergency, and it's one that we have to deal with, and to deal with some of the underlying causes as well.
And was America slow to recognize that emergency? Did it take the murder of your journalists to actually wake up to the threat that was there?
No, I think we had recognized it for some period of time. But obviously the rapid advances of ISIL in Iraq and the depredations of ISIL with respect to the Syrian civilian population in conjunction with our consultation with our allies, brought us ultimately to the conclusion that immediate action was necessary.
And you think you can defeat an ideology, do you?
We're going to defeat ISIL. In the end, the dealing with ISIL comes from the underlying causes. And the idea of ISIL is an idea that is fed by extremism. And what we have to do is to deal with the issue of extremism. And those are social, economic, political issues. And each country is going to have to look within its own borders and look within its own populations in ways to reduce those tendencies which feed the ideology of ISIL.
And if you fail, I know you don't like negatives, but if you fail?
We're going to continue at this. We're not going to stop. We're going to work very hard, obviously, to deal with the issue and the emergency of ISIL, but we have an obligation, a broader obligation, ultimately, to deal with these underlying social, political, and economic issues. And we're going to work very hard with our partners, not just in the region, but our partners around the globe to deal with this issue.
General, thanks very much.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks.